HuHa 2, ha!
Happy Harry's HuHa 2 Patridge!
Hello and welcome to Happy Harry's HuHa 2 How-Tos, episode 11. This one goes to 11. The very belated episode 11. I'm sorry about the wait. This was a difficult episode for me to put together. Originally I wanted to cover storytelling both in terms of sound and visuals, but it maybe made too much work for myself, so sound will be incorporated into the final episode next week. And today we're going to concentrate on the visuals that we've not really covered yet, like using camera and editing for your film and how to create a sense of storytelling. But because there's so much to cover, I should shut up now and jump right in. Here we go. So I'd like to quickly clarify what it is I mean by teaching storytelling. What it doesn't mean is teaching story outright. I won't be showing you how to generate your own ideas for characters and scenarios and plots and that sort of thing. In fact, I'm going to be teaching you more how to bring your already conceived ideas to life. I don't think I would be able to teach other people how to write stories, certainly not in the time that we have, and that isn't necessarily animation related anyway. Instead, I'm teaching you storytelling in a purely visual sense, and we'll look at audio a little bit as well. Maybe a few of these lessons could be relevant to people dealing in comics or live action film or another visual medium, but certainly we're not dealing with the actual creation of the story today. Also, similarly, I'm not dealing with sort of abstract imagery and how that creates emotions in people and how you can communicate your ideas in a non-narrative sense. Everything we're dealing with today is pretty grounded traditional storytelling. Now, a lot of this stuff we've already covered in previous episodes. The theme of today's episode is really bringing it all together, but we will be retreading some stuff. I kind of realise the irony now of talking about visuals while the only visual accompaniment I have is my wretched handwriting. But still, stick with me, hopefully there's interesting stuff to come. So remember, good storytelling is all about making the right choices, and there are so many choices that you'll have to make along the way. Just to begin with, the animation medium that you choose to work in alone can really affect how your film or your story comes out. I personally believe that any animation medium can tell any kind of story, but to give you an example, with 2D, you're not limited in any physical sense like you are with stop-motion puppetry, where you're having to make a physical object. In 2D, you can have your characters squash and stretch and explode into a shower of grapefruits if you want. So that might be better for a more sort of surreal, wacky story. But at the same time, on the other side, you've got 3D CGI animation and stop-motion puppetry, which you can create very realistic lighting with, and that might be better for a more sort of moody story that's maybe a little more grounded in the real world. Also, take into account how much time you can spend on your animation. If you can't do full animation where characters are moving constantly, maybe a more dialogue-driven story that has less action in it will be better. So right from the get-go, that's a big issue. Camera we haven't looked at yet, so that's something we're going to look at today, but the placement of the camera, the movement of the camera, the perspectives you use can all really impact upon your story. Characters, we've kind of looked at characters already, the way that they act, the way that they move, they hold themselves, their design, their color scheme, all of these will affect how the audience see them and how they relate to them. Backgrounds we've already looked at as well, just the setting that you put your world and characters in, the time of day, the sort of mood and the level of detail that you render your background with will affect how people see it and the world that your story is based in. Lighting and colors, really important as well. The mood that you can create with colours we've already looked at. The palette that you choose can give your film a certain tone. You can create a sense of sort of temperature. Other visuals, of course, will affect your story. The credits, the weather effects that you put on any kind of weird framing device on your screen, that will affect how people see your film. The editing is something, again, we'll look at today. That's the relationship that shots have with each other and how leaving a shot for longer on the screen will create a different sense of mood. And layout really is just a fancy way of talking about background and character placement and camera placement, and that's pretty much bringing everything together. So let's begin by looking at camera. So unless you're doing stop motion puppetry or old school 2D where you physically photograph each frame, you probably won't be using a real camera in your animation, but it's a nice shorthand to refer to what the audience member will see in the final product and the perspective that they're viewing it from. Also, I'll be using the confines of the flash stage here as the actual confines of the shot, much like if we were making a real film in flash. So remember, the border is not within or outside. As long as you see this dark line here, you'll know that I'm giving you a shot example and these are the confines. So let's begin. Here we have an establishing shot, and it's a great way to begin a scene. We draw the camera back, look at the location from afar, and don't really concentrate on showing action or anything like that, but grounding the audience in a physical place, letting them know things like what time of day it is, what period our film is set in, that sort of thing. Now, nothing that we look at today is a hard and fast rule by any means. You can have your establishing shot at the end of a scene, or you don't even have to have it in your film whatsoever. It's just a useful device for letting the audience know where they are. Here we have really another establishing shot, but this time it's on the interior of a location. Probably not the same igloo as before. This is some sort of dull office room, but again we get a sense of where the characters are placed, how many characters are in the scene, that sort of thing. Now we're going to look at the relationship between long shots, medium shots, and close-ups. Here we have a character who's pretty small in the frame because we're in a long shot right now. The nice thing about a long shot is that you can show a lot of the character's surroundings, much like an establishing shot, and if you want to show big, broad actions of the character running and leaping around, you can do that without needing to move the camera. One thing that the long shot is not so good at though is showing subtler facial emotion, and if you want to communicate emotion through a long shot, you'll need to do rather bold body language, and that might not be quite subtle enough for your film if you're making something a little bit more grounded in realism. Here we have the medium shot, and it's possibly the most used shot in any type of film. I don't know, that might be a complete generalization, but I feel it's probably the case. Certainly for comedies, they say that a kind of flat medium shot is sort of the best place to put your camera when you're trying to make a scene funny. And I agree, because it sort of displays the action so well, but you still get those facial emotions can still read on the character from a medium shot, but you can still get rather broad actions in as well. Here we have a close-up, and the close-up isn't good for sort of communicating a big bold action, but it's great to have the character expression. Here we've got a pretty extremely worried looking character, and you can communicate that maybe in a medium shot, but a close-up is also really good at doing that. But the nice thing about close-ups is if you want a more subtle emotion, you can still achieve that because the camera is so tight in on the character that you can really achieve that emotional change and still keep it rather subtle. That might not be right for your film. Maybe you don't want to cram that much emotion down people's throats. I know that some directors actually avoid the close-up for that reason, but I still think it's a very useful device. The placement and the perspective of the camera will also affect how the audience sees your characters. Here we've placed the camera up high, and it makes our character look quite small in the shot. Now this doesn't have to be because it's the point of view of a large character looking down on them, although that would work very well. I think it can also make the character seem small in a more emotional way, as if they're sort of shown to be in awe of maybe a large task ahead of them, or they're shown to feel small in their surroundings. Actually, the long shot is very good at doing that as well, because we're literally taking the character, creating them small in the background to emphasize the space around them. And it's a similar deal with this high angle shot. However, if we do the flip side and actually put the camera down low, we can show everyone that our character doesn't have any junk. But on top of that, it makes them appear very imposing and more dominant than when the camera is up high. It makes them look larger than life. Now, they're not that threatening without any junk, but still, I hope my point still stands. Here, with the camera tilted down to one side, we have something called a Dutch angle. Now, I'm not sure exactly what's Dutch about it, but it's pretty good for creating a sense of sort of disorientation, because things are a little uneven, almost like you're drunk. It's used a heck of a lot in the film Thor. Kenneth Branagh was probably a big fan of the Dutch angle and wanted to get it in as much as possible. It's also used in Battlefield Earth, but don't watch that. If you need to see an example of the Dutch angle, check out Thor. Another way that you can create a sort of unnatural or distorted vision of your world to help support your storytelling is by using this sort of forced perspective. Here we've got a shot where I've basically mimicked a fisheye camera lens, which is a kind of very distorted, rounded, wide-angle lens. And by doing that, we can kind of lend our world this sort of sense of unease, I think, or it makes it almost like the character is being watched by a real organic eye, which is pretty useful in storytelling. Often when two characters occupy a scene together, you'll see something called a two-shot, which is probably, like it sounds, a medium shot of two characters on the screen at the same time. Very good for dialogue, maybe not so good for action, because you can't really get in any of those broad movements because we're up quite close. This is pretty much the bread and butter of every early Kevin Smith film. But just to give you an example of maybe how we can mix it up, maybe make it a little more interesting, here is a shot where we've actually moved the camera back behind the head of the other character so that we're concentrating here on this chap, and we've still got them both in shot, but we can maybe get a better idea of his facial expressions and his delivery, although it doesn't always have to be the person who's talking that we concentrate on. Oftentimes it's more relevant to actually see the reaction shot of the other character, as we can see here. I apologise for these very cheap little lines I've drawn around the edge of the character to show shock. Actually, that's kind of a good example of what we were talking about earlier with the idea of sort of extra graphics that are neither characters nor effects, but something like that, which you'll see in a lot of animes when people are kind of, I don't know, scared or bewildered. I'm sure someone will tell me what it actually means. My favourite is the little mushroom of sort of expelled air which comes out of the mouth. Yeah, that doesn't look strange at all. But while we're talking about this, it makes for a pretty good segue into discussing something called the 180-degree rule, which is not so much a storytelling convention, but it's a filmmaking convention which will support your storytelling if you understand it. Here we see our characters from a bird's eye view, and I'm not really offering this up as a camera angle, although that could work in some scenarios. Instead, this is to help us draw an imaginary line between our two characters, and then we can draw a sort of semicircle to get that 180 degrees. Now, imagine that we can put our camera absolutely anywhere within this 180 degrees. So if we put our camera here and call that camera A, we'd get something like this previous shot. Actually, let's call that shot A, and put another camera here. We're going to get, call that shot B, camera B. Now, that's fine. We could put the camera here, which would sort of give us something closer to our original two-shot. You can even have the camera over here looking this way, although you'd probably not get much of this lady character here, as it'd be shot over the man's shoulder. But what happens when we put the camera all the way over there is you actually get a switch, and it would go from the man appearing on the left and the woman appearing on the right to the reverse, which would look something akin to this. Now, this only really comes into play in editing, and the problems can arise if you go from a shot where the camera is on this side of the characters to the camera being on this side of the characters. Then it looks to the audience often like they've switched places, which can be quite disorientating and confusing, and that might be what you're going for. Often if you want to create a confusing state for your audience, it can be good to do that, but usually if that's not something you're going for, it's a good idea to stick to that 180-degree rule. Now, just to give you another example, let's say we've got two shots and these come one after another in the editing sequence, and shot A is the character running from left to right. Just another example. Now, the next shot is the character running from right to left, but not because the character's changed direction, only because we've actually moved our camera to be on the other side of that character. Now, that is another problem because we've broken the 180-degree rule, and it gives the impression the characters switched direction when they really haven't. So that's something to bear in mind. Now let's talk a little about composition. Good composition not only helps your film look prettier, but can also help you with your storytelling because you're guiding the audience to look at the things that are important in the shot or the scene. Here we have our bland shot of our boring character stood in the middle of the field, and because he's completely by himself, I think it's a kind of a no-brainer that we'd sort of centrifugally focus on him and put him in the middle of the shot. Although sometimes you don't want to do that, and sometimes you can't do that. Now here we have a two-shot, and because we want to see both of these characters' faces, I can't go and plonk the camera behind one of their shoulders easily. So this brings into play something called the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds is basically splitting our shot into 9 squares by placing 2 vertical lines equal distance apart and 2 horizontal lines equal distance apart, which creates not only the lines across our image, but also points at which they intersect. And that's where we're going to place the important parts of our shot. So for example, we probably want the horizon to fall at about here on this line, and the main characters themselves fall on these 2 horizontal lines. But the faces which we really want to draw attention to actually fall here at the intersection. It would be better maybe if it fell on the character's eyes, but that's pretty much close enough. Remember, we say it's a rule of thirds, but it's only a real suggestion for what to do. But to show you what would happen if we kind of disregarded that, here's the main character here, or, well, he looks like the main character now because he's in the middle of the shot. But he's placed in the middle, and that might not quite be right. This character's too far off to the sides. The horizon is smack bang in the middle of the shot, which might not be right. We've got a character here, some sort of dragon fighting a warrior, and because I really want the dragon to be something that we look at, I'm placing the dragon's head on this line here, and this horizon line here is pretty much where the actual horizon of the scene is, and that helps, I think, emphasize the importance of the dragon. He's taking up the majority of the shot, and we've composed it so that his head, his big dangerous looking head, which our hero here needs to look out for, is along this horizontal line. So we're only loosely sticking with the rule of thirds here, but we're still keeping it in the back of our mind. Here we've got another shot of a character and his little cottage, and because I think he's important, I've sort of placed him here on this horizon line, and he's fairly near the intersection. He's not quite on it exactly, but also I want the sort of warm little cottage of his to also be an important aspect, so I've placed the door around the intersection, and the house sits sort of neatly on top of the horizon again. Now let's talk a little about camera movement. Of course, we don't have a physical camera, so we can't easily move it. However, we can create the illusion of movement with some pretty clever animation, and I think that camera movement has great storytelling potential because you can help to create the illusion in your audience that they're moving through a real place, and that helps involve them, I think, more in the story of your film. So let's open up this scene here. Now, there are many different kinds of camera moves you'll see in live action films. There are dollies on tracks, there are crane shots which the camera lifts high into the air, and we can only sort of roughly recreate those. Here I have a shot where the camera is sort of traveling through a city from left to right, and it's pretty dull, it's pretty flat. There's a way we can actually make that far, far better, and that's by using something called parallax. Now in parallax, what happens is the things further away from the audience actually move slower than the things closer to the audience. See, that had a lot more depth to it. Just to show you again, as a comparison, here's no parallax with everything moving at the same speed. Looks like a flat image, and here it is with parallax again. So that could be really a dolly move, which is where the camera is placed on a track and moved from left to right, or it could be a pan where the character, or the camera rather, sorry, stays in place and is actually sort of swung from left to right. But that's either way a pretty good way of representing camera movement in your film. Here's another example of kind of the zoom, the camera zoom, and the dolly again, but dollying forward on a track. Here's the camera just flatly zooming into the scene. Everything, what we're doing is we're using tweens to create the effect of the whole scene sort of blowing up and expanding, which creates that image of a zoom in. But what we're going to do now is similar to with our previous camera movement. We're going to have everything increase but at slightly different speeds, and that actually helps to create a sense of moving through the scene on a dolly. I'll show that to you again. See, the table is actually getting bigger quicker than the floor, which is moving slower than the chair, and this sort of creates the illusion that we're moving through a scene when all we're doing is tweening art bigger or smaller. And if you revert back to episode 1 to look at the Flash basics, I talk about tweening there. just to show you again that example, here's a zoom, which might be perfect for your film, but here's an actual camera movement through your scene. Now we're going to look at editing, and rather than examine isolated shots, I'm going to play a whole scene from a film that I've been working on for a while in its animatic state, meaning there's no finished art, there isn't even any sound yet, but hey, that means I can talk through it and explain, hopefully, some of my choices for creating a sort of atmospheric and rather disturbing scene for the opening of a film that's quite slow-paced. We'll look at some faster-paced editing next week, but this is the opening to a film called Outsider. So the scene begins with a fade up from white as the boat rolls in to the left, and we have a boy there fishing on the right who's quite important for the beginning of the scene. We show our traveller coming off the boat, waving, and then pulling out a map. Of course, this is all obvious to anyone watching, you don't need audio for this yet, but I'll run you through the audio. He addresses the boy and asks if he knows where he can get something to eat. He's just come into town, the boy doesn't respond. He notes that the place doesn't have many buildings and that he can't see anywhere he could get something to eat. The boy finally responds and says, "How did you get here?" To which he says, "The boat, of course," and we reveal there is no boat, which is a little unnerving for the man. He says, "Anyway, where can I get something to eat?" The boy says, "Through the dark forest, the next town over," and we end with a kind of an unnerving musical sting. Okay, so let's now take a look at those shots in a little more detail, and I'll explain why I chose them. So I'm going to talk you through the majority of my editing decisions, not quite all of them, but how I hope they all support the storytelling of the film, which is what it's all about today. So to begin with, we fade up from white, which I don't actually see too often happen, but it's a nice alternative to fading up from black, and I think helps lend this scene a kind of foggy, dreamlike, ethereal flavour, which is sort of echoed with, you can't quite make them out here, but there's also rolling clouds of fog as well along the dock. Now this is an establishing shot, so actually pull back quite far and show everything quite clearly in a pretty simple profile setup, and it's a very long shot too. It lasts for a long time, and I sort of wanted to establish fairly quickly that the pace of this beginning scene was pretty slow. So when the character actually begins to come off the boat, we have the knapsack here thrown down, and actually the background is blurred out, and I did that to emphasize the importance of the traveller's bag and quickly establish that this character was a traveller. This was an important part of his character design and as a prop that he uses throughout. So when he actually lands and gets off the boat, I have the character facing away from us because I'm kind of burying the lead a little bit. I like to do sort of slower reveals of characters if I can. And I've got him waving here, which is an action that sort of supports his rather friendly and outgoing disposition. And I've also gone for quite a low angle to imply that he's fairly confident, he's fairly dominant. But the speed of the shots actually picks up a little bit here. Again, now we cut to a close-up, and I'm sort of pushing that he's a smiling, happy character. Emotion is very important in this scene, so we're sort of showcasing that quite blatantly. Again, we're sort of pushing the emotion in his eyes and mouth here as he arrives with his map and is beginning to look confused as things start to get a little bit unnerving for him because he doesn't quite know where he is. Here I do a focal shift where we actually go from the character being in focus previously here on this frame to actually being out of focus as he addresses the boy, and the sort of emphasis switches to the boy. Again, we've got the boy out of focus here and the character quite small in the scene. I sort of wanted to emphasize in this shot that he is out of his depth and a little bit, maybe a little nervous, and I think that's helped by going with a camera angle that makes him small in the shot. Here we've gone for quite a high angle looking down on the boy, and I did that really for the purpose of actually casting his face into shadow here, because we want him to be mysterious, we want to obscure him and his sort of what he looks like. Here again, we're still pushing the emotion of the character, and we're in quite tight close-up for most of the shots with him in. In fact, that only really changes when we go to the wide shot in a moment and show the boat. The pan here, of course, another sort of establishing shot showing what the city looks like, but again, still keeping the character in close-up until we have the big reveal that the boat has gone, and hopefully that should sort of emphasize that something unusual is going on, that things aren't quite what they seem. until finally we get the slow zoom into the dark and murky forest at the end, which sets up the next part of the film. Now, I know that's not much of a forest drawing, but we'll flesh it out more next week. We'll actually be working on a different film then, and we'll make something from scratch and bring together all of the colours and sound and everything we can to make a complete animation from scratch and sort of be heading into the unknown wilderness ourselves. So join me then for hopefully a more punctual episode of Happy Harry's HuHa 2 How-Tos.